Hello and welcome to this Africa Travel Week webinar with PAWS, an international welfare organisation for animals under human influence. I think many of us were very encouraged by the bold announcement recently by Environmental Affairs Minister Barbara Creasy when she released that high-level panel report which advocates putting an end to captive lion breeding. This is a significant step forward, but we all acknowledge that there's a very long road ahead. So businesses have an opportunity to lead in the international sector. And joining me today to unpack how animal welfare and tourism have been shaped through the pandemic, I have PAWS South Africa's Country Director, Fiona Miles, on the call with me. You know the drill. If you have a question for Fiona, please put it into the Q&A folder for me at the bottom of your screen, the Q&A folder. And the chat is open, as you know. We are also recording the session. Fiona, I'd like to hand over to you now to take us through your presentation.
Thanks very much, Natalia. If you can give me just a moment to share my screen. There we go. Oopsie daisies. Interesting. One seckie. It worked a moment ago. And so now.
There we go.
There we go. Right, so thank you very much firstly for the opportunity to speak with you all today about this topic. Just as an introduction, PAWS, as Natalia mentioned, is a global animal welfare organization for animals under direct human influence. We work along the lines of revealing suffering, rescuing animals in need and protection, and actually providing lifetime protection for those individuals who might need them. We work with farm animals, companion animals, and wild animals, and our vision is a world where humans treat animals with respect, empathy, and understanding. Animal welfare and pandemics. Obviously, the link between animal welfare and human health has never been so clear as it is right now. According to the World Health Organization, 75% of new or emerging infectious diseases are originating from animals. And we believe that animal welfare needs to be prioritized to reduce the risk of future pandemics. So the time to act is really now. And I'd like to play for you a very short video, if I can do so. If it just plays. So, as mentioned, sorry, I'm just trying to move to the next slide now. Sorry. As mentioned, obviously, if they suffer, we suffer. And what PAWS is really wanting to promote is the one welfare approach to looking at our world and looking at the interconnectedness between human welfare, animal welfare, and the welfare of the environment. And it's time to make welfare overall a global priority. Having one welfare as a guiding principle and base for our demands means that we need a paradigm shift that includes animals and their welfare in our overall thinking, in the way that we treat ourselves, in the way we treat the planet, in the way that we do our business and go about our daily business. And so PAWS is demanding and has some key demands in terms of this one welfare approach. We want to see an end to the cruel farming and killing of animals for their fur, as we saw recently, where millions of animals had to be put down due to outbreaks. That's not sustainable. It's absolutely frightening when you think of the suffering that goes on in some of these facilities, as you saw from the video as well. Just the way in which animals have to languish in really inappropriate keeping conditions is frightening. We would like to see an end to factory farming, which is the intensive farming of animals for our consumption. We'd like to see the end of the dog and cat meat trade in Southeast Asia. Once again, millions of animals being consumed and suffering in atrocious conditions, and stopping the commercial trade of wild animals. And this is where we're going to put a bit of a focus today in our presentation. The role of the tourism industry. One of the key ideas that we would like to promote is travel in kind. Now more than ever, people are wanting to travel on holiday, to come to South Africa and all over the world, but do so in a responsible manner. And so PAWS is encouraging the concept of travel kind, and have some materials and so on that everybody can have access to in terms of what that means for us. If I can just move on to the next slide. And to focus in on, I want to say to focus in on our fourth demand, the key demand in terms of ending the commercial trade of wild animals. As mentioned by Natalia, the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environmental Affairs has taken this landmark decision to end the captive breeding of big cats for commercial purposes in South Africa. And there will be obviously some fundamental impacts and changes needed within the tourism industry, because some of these activities, of course, are impacted. So the breeding of lions for commercial purposes, and the intensive breeding of lions for commercial purposes, is what needs to end, so that voluntourism opportunities, tourism interactions and tourist interactions with wild animals such as cub-petting, bottle feeding, the use of animals in photo props, walking with lion experiences, and what's also frightening, and one thing I think is worth noting within this sort of tourism aspect, is the fact that many of the facilities that are open to the public actually rent their lions from breeding farms to make them available for these interactions, and those lions then get pushed in and out of the industry. So just to keep a note on that, is that many of those animals are actually rented out to facilities that the tourism industry is then obviously promoting. Trophy hunting, of course, and then the trade in lion bones and derivatives is where the animals end up at the end of the day. PAWS released a report just prior to the announcement called The Vicious Cycle. We did a review, an in-depth review of the exploitation, not only of the captive bred lions in South Africa, but also of the people that are in this industry and are working within this industry. So to provide a little bit of context, the big cat industry and the breeding industry in South Africa has grown exponentially over the last years. In the 90s, it was estimated that there were about 50 big cat facilities housing around 2,500 big cats. At the moment, it's estimated that there's more than 300 facilities with more than 12,000 lions therein. Lions are not the only targets of this industry. There's also cheetah and other exotic animals such as tigers and jaguar and so on. Commercial purposes means primarily for tourism opportunities, obviously then the trophy hunting of captive bred animals, and then the demand for the parts and derivatives of the animals. This infographic just gives a little bit of a background as to what the industry actually sort of depicts, and what does the captive breeding industry look like for one animal in particular. So if we put ourselves in the shoes of one lion or lioness, basically the first step of this vicious cycle is that the lionesses are forced into intensive breeding. Cubs are removed within a matter of days from some of these lionesses, and they are sort of forced back into the breeding cycle as soon as possible, basically meaning that the animals would breed by far more than they would in the wild. These cubs are used for bottle feeding opportunities. They're hand raised in many instances by volunteers who are told that these animals are either rejected or by their mothers, or they're orphaned, or whatever the case may be, and that, you know, from a conservation perspective, they have to be hand raised and interacted with in order to survive. That, of course, by now we know is not is not true, due to sort of the intensity of the breeding in many of the facilities. Along with the bottle feeding of the animals, as the animals grow up, many of them are used in walking with experiences. So it's, you know, the whole attraction to walk with a lion in the bushveld, or whatever the case may be, might seem very attractive. But if one has already considered how that lion has entered into that phase of the cycle, one realizes soon that it's not going in the right direction. At about 2 years old, the animals are obviously too big to be interacted with and not safe anymore, and so they're either put back into the breeding cycle, they are sort of forced to breed, or they are then sold on for further purposes, such as either being utilized for their bones or in trophy hunting. So it's all around the entire life cycle. Sort of looks like this in reality. When one sees a facility where there's these kind of images, obviously it's clear that it's an intensive breeding situation, that the animals are being forced into situations that they're not supposed to be in. Myself personally have been to some facilities where the cubs are so young that their eyes are not even open, and yet they're sort of in a public space, they are exposed to people, and it's really heartbreaking to see that. So this just depicts, just in some further numbers, the fact that there's now 3 times more lions in captivity than there are lions in the wild. They live in overcrowded conditions, and depending on the animals themselves and so on, they can fetch up to. We've seen some experiences where some animals for trophy hunting fetch hundreds of thousands of rands. So some of the key findings from our report was we revealed basically that there's a lack of regulation. Obviously, there's a lack of regulation that allows for these tens of thousands of animals to be suffering and languishing in cruel conditions across South Africa for economic gain of individuals. We exposed the link between the big cat breeding industry and Asia's wildlife product trade, specifically for traditional medicine and, of course, the trophy industry, and then really delve into first-hand interviews with workers on these facilities and kind of document what shameful and often illegal working conditions that they're exposed to. It's really sad, and we've also seen firsthand the kind of treatment, the lack of regulation around the people who work on site. So exploitation of big cats, as we've mentioned, there's no binding national standards and legislation for animal welfare for these big cats. The existing legislation and regulation of animal welfare and husbandry is sort of self-regulated at the moment. We've seen so many facilities where these animals are being held in dirty, overcrowded enclosures, in inhumane conditions. The suffering that they have in terms of lack of veterinary care is really frightening. And approximately 60 pathogens have been recorded in captive lions, and 83 diseases associated with those. So in terms of our investigation, it shows that farmers do not provide the adequate welfare requirements which are internationally acceptable in terms of good nutrition, environment, health, mental state, and appropriate behaviour. I'd like to just sort of discuss a little bit around that in terms of the welfare issues. Nutrition is really impacted in terms of the animals being removed from their mothers at a very young age. They lack the necessary nutrition to grow strong, and so later on in life really develop some serious health conditions as a result thereof, and then ongoing. In terms of environment, the poor keeping conditions and lack of proper shelter, because of the lack of safety standards in some of these facilities, there's no way to really keep the enclosures clean and sort of hygienic for the animals, and therefore obviously the people. A severe lack of medical attention and care for those animals. A positive mental state means enrichment and sort of stimulation that they would normally sort of experience in the wild, and that is really sort of very heartbreaking to see as well. And it means that they don't display the appropriate behaviors that one would normally see in nature. The report also goes into, and we did a study over a period of 10 years on the CITES trade database, in terms of the trade from South Africa, and in terms of what South Africa has actually reported. And 88% of the lion trophies that were exported were captively sourced. And if one thinks that of the life cycle, and I'll just go back again, thinking about the entire life cycle of the animals, that's really, it's really frightening. 97% of the skeletons and bones and parts and derivatives were captively sourced, which means that those animals have all been in one way or another intensively bred, may have been exposed to people through the tourism industry, and ultimately end up, as you see over there in your screen. So the South African's captive lion industry is certainly fueling the demand for all these products, and this is why it's so important that it does actually come to an end. I'm just also a little bit conscious of time, so just another infographic just to quickly depict the fact that of the skeletons, for instance, that have been exported for use in traditional Chinese medicine, over the 10-year period, that's 573 per year. 97% were born, as I mentioned, from captive bred lions. 49% went to the Lao People's Democratic Republic, and 43% to Vietnam. In terms of trophies, the majority share went to the United States. And also frightening is that over nearly 2,000 live lions were exported, giving us the indication that obviously if live animals are being exported, they're obviously going into further intensive breeding in other countries for the purpose of utilizing them either in tourism or again for their parts. And that's obviously not great that we're exporting our wildlife out of South Africa for those purposes either. In terms of the exploitation of workers, as you can see from these pictures, not ideal, completely unsafe. We did a number of we did a number of case studies, which are depicting the situation for workers. At a particular breeding farm where there were 240 predators in total, there were only 3 managers and 8 farm workers. And in terms of human resource management, no qualifications were required to work there. There were no legal binding employment contracts. The employees were working below the minimum wage and mainly for cash in hand. No sort of annual leave entitlements. A huge sort of breach and break in sort of the labor relations and labor laws in South Africa. In terms of standards and good keeping standards and so on, I mean, safety is obviously paramount. And what we found is that there was no reasonable and decent safety protocols in place, especially in terms of the way that, you know, many of the enclosures are set up and the way that the workers actually have to work in order to feed and or clean or whatever. There was no defensive equipment to protect the workers should they be in trouble. Cleaning protocols were almost non-existent in terms of decent sanitization, protective clothing, disinfectants, and various other things. And in many cases, there were more animals than permits actually allowed for the particular facility. So of great concern, of course, is forcing employees to work without these safety protocols and without contracts. And one alarming thing certainly is that it was reported that employees that might have been injured on duty were encouraged not to report those injuries, or even forced not to report those injuries. So yeah, it's all around. It's absolutely shocking for that. So it's not just obviously the workers workers there, but of course it's the tourists that come to facilities that are open to the public and where tourists are able to interact with these animals. All of that is behind the scenes, but certainly what they see in front of the scenes and what they're told by the facilities in terms of conservation and protection and so on is clearly not completely transparent. And in many cases, and we also had a look over a 10-year period in terms of only the instances where animal attacks or injuries had been reported. And these, of course, not everything has been reported. So as we can see, 73% of attacks on people or on tourists by lions is quite a significant number. Regardless of whether or not there's a sign or a little thing that says don't touch the animals, people are going to there are many instances where people can interact with the animals, and that's obviously just leaves the door wide open for potential harm. And of course, at the end of the day, not only is the person harmed, but the animal at the end of the day may also be ending up being put down for that reason. I'd like to play you a short video now once again. So circling back around to the announcement by the department, it's clear that there are more questions than answers right now in terms of the time frame that this is all planned to roll out in terms of ending captive breeding in South Africa, how the implementation will look, what the consultation process will consist of, and who will be consulted, repercussions for the trophy hunting industry, repercussions for even tourism, and any potential loopholes. So what we want to encourage is that animal welfare must be at the forefront of the government's considerations, so that there's a clear solution for the more than 12,000 captive lions in South Africa, as well as all the other big cats. And we need to make sure that considerations are given to to everybody, and especially the tourism industry, as well as people like ourselves as non-profit organizations, to be able to come to the table and offer input as useful stakeholders. So in terms of that, we're really looking forward to the government's policy papers and everything else that they've promised. But from our perspective, the solution is obviously to focus really on ethical tourism and how we can promote ethical tourism in South Africa to the rest of the world and bring people here for the right reasons. This should really be prioritized as a part of that whole consultation process, to ensure that South Africa actually is seen as one of the top destinations for wildlife viewing. So the recommendations so far that we've come up with and have made are that should owned lions or people who own lions need to keep those animals. They need to be kept under the highest and best animal welfare standards, and under conditions that they are sterilized and not used for breeding. And it's been made clear that obviously breeding is going to be, intensive breeding for commercial purposes is going to be done away with. So how is that going to look? Owners must provide species appropriate care in terms of enclosure sizes, the dietary needs of these animals, veterinary care, behavioral needs, and obviously keeping the animals free from suffering. We would strongly encourage that wherever possible, a facility is transformed from an intensive captive breeding facility to one that is more along the lines and the nature of a sanctuary that provides lifelong home and care, giving those owners the responsibility to actually care for those animals in an appropriate way and see out the rest of their lives in a suitable way. PAWS operates a true sanctuary and operates a sanctuary that, as I mentioned, has rescued over 150 big cats from around the world. And we've learned a lot in terms of the highest standards of keeping and all of that. Another very important and key point is that individual animals are given the medical attention that they need in order to have a good quality of life. And for those animals that absolutely have conditions that mean that they suffer on a daily basis and so on, that if there is the very last resort, that if there is going to be euthanasia, that it's humane and done under strict veterinary attention and supervision. And if that is the case, then that, of course, there's strictly responsible disposal of those animals so that they don't end up, again, in the whole illegal system and illegal trade of their parts and derivatives. So just in terms of what we do at Lions Rock, Big Cat Sanctuary, we've been in operation for about 15 years now. We have rescued animals from all over the world from really shocking keeping conditions, whether they be really substandard zoos, circuses, pardon me, private keeping, obviously from the canned hunting industry as well, directly here in South Africa. The way in which we work is to ensure that if an animal has been surrendered or rescued and has been brought to Lions Rock, the facilities or the circus or wherever that they've come from would normally have, we would work with the authorities to ensure that there's not a perpetuation of more animals coming in, but rather that facility is closed or drastic measures are taken to ensure that there's no further possibility for animal suffering. And then we just look after them for the rest of their lives giving them the opportunity to live in the most natural way possible. So this is just a very short video on Lions Rock. So I think just in conclusion, you know, the pandemic has brought about massive stress, economic stress around the world, and in particular to the tourism industry, and certainly NGOs like ourselves have felt that. And so I suppose the question of having to try to change things, to have the consideration of animal welfare and sustainable, you know, considerations, thinking of animal welfare as part of a holistic part of your business plan and part of the business would extend all the way across. So this is one particular area of focus that we've discussed today, but there's so many other areas, small things that businesses can do to put into consideration animal welfare in the tourism industry, because really I think that at the end of the day it's going to draw a lot more attention and a lot more demand for ethical tourism, for responsible tourism, for green tourism, for people to actually experience South Africa in a completely different way from the moment that they arrive to the experiences that they have within their accommodation facilities, you know, seeing things like not tested on animals or animal-friendly products, meals that are more climate-friendly, all the way around. There's many things that we can do to draw attention and yeah, I think really put South Africa back on the map as an ethical and responsible tourism destination, because we have so much to offer. So I'd like to thank you for your attention and hand over back to Natalia.
Thank you so much, Fiona, for that really interesting presentation. If you do have a question for Fiona, please feel free to put that in the Q&A. Fiona, I'm going to ask you to put yourself on mute when I'm talking, because there's a little bit of background noise that comes up. And also to stop sharing your screen. Here we go. You can just also mute yourself when I ask the question and then unmute yourself. Perfect. So we've got no background noise. Right. So let's get into our questions. And Edward's asked, how many bona fide sanctuaries do we have and who is responsible for law enforcement?
Great question. Thank you very much. So if we define what is a true sanctuary, a true sanctuary is a facility that does not breed, does not hunt, does not trade, does not allow animal interactions. And so those, in terms of big cats, now I'm speaking just specifically in terms of big cats, there's only about 5 in South Africa, which obviously puts a huge amount of pressure on those facilities to be able to take in animals that need to be rescued. From various places. It's not just obviously within South Africa, but from around the world. So, and in terms of law enforcement, the sanctuaries and facilities have to have permits to, you know, to operate and to have the animals. The NSPCA is responsible for inspections, as well as the Department of Environment, obviously, for inspections and so on. So law enforcement obviously would come through police and other things where there would be illegal activities, the hawks and so on.
Right. Louise has asked, in your opinion, how many of the existing breeding facilities would be willing to change their business model from breeding lions and other cats for commercial purposes to a true sanctuary with a donor-driven and possibly ecotourism income stream?
Louise, that's a good question. I think you and I have been working on this for such a long time. I would like to know your opinion too. I think it's a very difficult question. I think it needs, firstly, engagement and discussion and considerations of alternatives first. I mean, do people actually know that? Well, I'm sure that they do, and of course, it's a very lucrative situation to be when you're buying and selling and trading in wild animals. So whether or not let's say the feasibility of it will be appreciated and seen by a facility, I'm not sure. But I certainly think that the ones that are open for the public that are breeding can definitely be considered in terms of that.
So Manaz asked in the chat, am I understanding correctly that the solution for animals that are healthy but cannot be cared for appropriately should be euthanized where possible? Sandparks has suggested the euthanasia option as well. 8,000 to 10,000 cats is a lot, and while I appreciate that sick cats shouldn't be considered for euthanasia, isn't there an opportunity for Lions Rock, Shamwari, and other sanctuaries worldwide to take these cats Can you work with government, NGOs and people to raise funds for this to occur?
Big question. So yes, I mean, at the moment as it stands, and without knowing and understanding the implementation plan from government, euthanasia should certainly be a last option. And where possible, for facilities and sanctuaries to already be able to expand and be able to take in some of those animals would certainly be fantastic. I do, however, think that the onus needs to be on the people who've been allowed to, and government, and of course the breeders themselves, to take responsibility and adapt to the new, what's going to be the new normal in terms of breeding and so on. So that sterilization is certainly an option so that we can, stop the breeding. But dumping the lions onto somebody else and it's no longer your problem, I think is also not the only solution. So yes, I think where possible, animals that can be rescued or brought into facilities that exist is okay. But I really think that the onus needs to be on the owners themselves to take the necessary and responsible measures to stop breeding and to take ownership of the situation alongside the various other options. If that answers the question, I hope.
Well, we'll see. You let us know if it doesn't. A question from my side, and I know that it's a long road ahead and that the door is open, but it hasn't opened completely, and we have a long road to go along. But to what extent do you think that making this bold statement, taking this decision, will influence other parts of the world that are still involved in captive breeding of cats and wildlife? Do you think they will look at South Africa and say, well, if South Africa's done it, it makes business sense, we should all be doing this, it's bad for our tourism destination reputation? Do you think other parts of the world will look to South Africa and do similar things in other parts of the world?
I certainly hope so, and I think all eyes are on us at the moment in terms of, depending on what that plan is going to look like, in terms of implementation, and depending on if there's really a good and strong consultation process where all of these different factors are taken into consideration, where really specialists from veterinary care to tourism, as I mentioned earlier on, to NGOs and others, as well as, of course, the breeders and everybody else, are really properly consulted with, and there's a good, strong plan that has strength and merit. I think we'd be setting the stage for some big changes. Maybe I'm being over optimistic now, but I do think that there's the possibility. It's up to us as South Africa, how we deal with it. So all eyes are on, and we will be setting the stage, certainly, because there are so many wild animals in tourism that deserve to be.
You mentioned it's up to us, and I was just wondering, while we wait for the clarity that we're all hoping to get quite soon from the ministry on what this actually looks like and how it's being rolled out, from the tourism industry side, if there were just a couple of things that tourism stakeholders could be doing to make sure that they don't perpetuate what is happening, what would some of those things be?
Some of I think the most, let's say, sort of simple things to do would be to, depending on what kind of stakeholder and who you are, but certainly not to promote facilities that allow wild animal interactions. So, not encouraging people or advertising as part of packages or anything else, facilities and possibilities that allow wild animal interaction whatsoever. I think that will go a long way to sort of reinforcing that decision, and reinforcing the drive more towards ethical facilities, or where people want to see and don't really have so much time to spend in a national park, for instance, then to direct them to sanctuaries and ethical facilities. I would also say really encouraging people to visit the national parks and the wild areas to see animals in their natural environment, because the more I think they are supported, and the more funds come in there, the more conservation and protection and expansion and things they can do to provide the appropriate sort of the way we want it to look, if I can put it that way.
Mm. Edward said, are there decision trees or guidelines for best practices as a set standard when it comes to determining the individual outcome on whether an animal will be euthanized or up for retirement at a sanctuary? How do you make that decision?
In terms of up for retirement at a sanctuary, I think that sort of goes back to then considering, well, then an animal has sort of served its useful commercial purpose, and now we don't want the responsibility of giving it the best care lifelong. So the whole lifetime of that captive bred lion needs to be under good conditions and good keeping conditions. In terms of an animal that's, needs to be, well, considered to be euthanized, I think it's really the vet needs to, like for instance, with us at Lions Rock, I'll just use a practical example. We've rescued animals from all over the world. Their origination and their start in life was also very, very difficult. So, I mean, they've had really, a hard life, a tough life. They've lived out, good quality of life then at Lions Rock, but at some point in time maybe have developed underlying conditions as a result of the original keeping. And we would work with the vet to consider the best quality of life that is still possible, whether it's certain medication or maybe a change of diet or addition of vitamins or certain, things that might just improve the quality of life. But at some point in time, if you see that then the quality of life cannot be extended any further, then the vet would make that decision. And it's a really difficult decision to make, for sure.
Yeah, I'm just, based on the fact that this is a webinar with tourism stakeholders on, I wondered if I could just ask you to maybe address why the ending of captive lion breeding is actually really important for the tourism industry from a destination reputation perspective.
I think if one, sorry, pardon me, if one just considers as a tourism destination, we wanting to promote our incredibly beautiful landscapes, wildlife, so many different things that South Africa has to offer. And then we, as part of that wildlife promotion, are then promoting visiting facilities that offer a very quick wildlife interaction experience. So you pay your money, you can cuddle a lion cub, you can walk with a lion, you can have your lunch, and off you go to your next thing. Depending on how that's being sold, people might believe that that's authentic. If you then take that cub that you've just interacted with, or that sort of sub-adult lion that you've just walked with, and you go back to where that animal originated, how it ended up in that facility, and where it's going to end up at the end of that life cycle. And now it's known to the world in terms of, this has been sort of well documented, well proven, and revealed to the world. It's completely sort of unsustainable anymore that people would actually think to participate in that. So therefore, education around this is essential for those people who don't know it, and certainly from the tourism industry, not to promote that, because how could you feel well to promote an activity where is entrenched in animal suffering? It's completely against that, and of course it's severely damaging to brand South Africa.
And it's actually connecting the dots, because what they don't see as tourists is the animal suffering, but there's a backstory behind. So it's our role to highlight what that backstory is, essentially. Yes. Any parting words from you, Fiona, as we end our webinar today?
Wow. When the minister made her announcement, I burst into tears, and maybe, as I said, it may be a little bit premature in terms of that, but just the idea that South Africa is willing to make a shift, and it's on the table now, changes the whole dynamic. We're not just saying, please don't, but we actually now have some power. Our voices somehow have been heard, and we can now the work is going to begin, and we all have to work collectively. So all those different parts, as I said, I'm still very optimistic. There's a long road ahead. A lot of hard work by many people, and not everybody's going to be satisfied with everything that comes out of it. But for me, certainly, there's a small light at the end of the tunnel that we can end the suffering, at least for big cats, in South Africa, and certainly start promoting South Africa once again. And I really hope that the tourism industry is going to see and reap the benefits of this one, obviously, part. There's obviously so many parts, but certainly in this particular topic, let's put our backs into it and really get government to stick to that promise.
Mm. Oh, they're coming in thick and fast now. Sorry, Fiona.
I see. No problem.
Anyway, Lenore said, while we wait for government to implement a plan, is the status quo continuing, the breeding, slaughtering for bones and stockpiling of bones, which can then be exported illegally, or is there any law enforcement to prohibit these actions right now?
I don't think there's law enforcement prohibiting the actions right now, but as I understood it, basically, there would be policy guidelines and so on, like very, very soon and forthcoming, that would then give the outline. So there is a concern, obviously, that people are going to be now ramping up the exploitation, ramping up the, as you say, the slaughter and everything else. We haven't seen evidence of that, and as yet. But yeah, the sooner that these documents start coming out, the better, because we need to get on with the job.
Absolutely. And John said about 2 years ago, we saw Airbnb adopting guidelines tabled by World Animal Protection that govern experiences involving wild animals in the wild and in captivity, as well as domesticated animals under human care. All animal experiences offered on the platform have to fulfill a range of criteria to be badged as ethical, which allows guests to tell whether or not the experience follows those animal welfare best practices. Why can the same attitude not be adapted or adopted at national government level, as it is so needed?
It's a good question. And yes, I suppose those guidelines are going to have to be drafted. I mean, the SATS, as you said, already has guidelines. There are other guidelines in place. Us as 4PAWS have also developed standards, quality standards for our sanctuaries. So I think all of those need to be put forward. And as I mentioned earlier, and I hope I understood the question correctly, I think it's going to come into the consultation and what government is willing to take from all the expertise and experience out there to consider and put into consideration.
Last word from Fran, who said Botswana has received negative responses from some would-be tourists since the reintroduction of hunting. Many people are still shocked that there is legal hunting in South Africa. The ending of captive breeding and canned hunting can only be positive for Brand SA. Let's hope the wheels move visibly, and I'll add swiftly to that mix, Fran. Thank you so much for your time, Fiona, and to everyone who joined us today on the webinar. We have recorded it and we'll release it to everybody as well, should you wish to look back. And thank you again for your time, talking about a very important issue and very timeless with Minister Cruelty's announcement. Let's hope they do some stuff quickly for us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Very much. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Have a great time. Bye.